Hi, welcome to JJ Atkins Art. Today we're finishing up a series of videos based on Anchorman. Today we're going to be taking a look at Brian Fontana. Let's get started. Now, Paul Rudd is the actor that plays Brian Fontana in the Anchorman movies. And I have to confess here that Paul Rudd is something of one of my favorite actors. I've been a big fan of him for a number of years. I've loved just about any movie he starred in, and this is certainly one of my favorites as well. So when it came time to draw him, he was actually kind of the character I saved for last. Burgundy, Will Ferrell is obviously the big star of this movie, and if you go take a look, I'll put a little link up in the corner there. You can see the caricature for him and the other two kind of co-stars of the movie. But as I said before, I had this idea that I was going to be doing all four of the characters from the Anchorman movie, and Paul Rudd was the one I saved for last. It's almost kind of like the dessert to finish up the project, if that makes sense. Now, drawing Paul Rudd in just about any other movie would have been a relatively easy task, but this one was a little bit challenging because of the costume that he had on. Not so much the clothes, but the longer hair and the mustache really hide a good piece of his face, and if the face is what we're looking for in terms of resemblance, it can be a little bit challenging pulling that off unless you're getting really, really detail-oriented with some of the smaller aspects of his face that you can get the resemblance from. Now, what I'm referring to here is more his eyes and his nose, and maybe even a little bit of his lower lip. But the focus for me on this particular piece was the eyes. I felt like I was kind of close to the caricature a couple of times and wasn't quite getting it until I really honed in on the eye area. Now, having said that, what you're seeing in this video is really, I think, something like my fourth or fifth attempt to try to get the head sketched down in a way that I liked. And if you notice here, it's not really quite dead on yet. The hair isn't quite right. Your mileage may vary on whether or not you think this is a good caricature. I think that's somewhat open for interpretation, but I do think I got the resemblance in the eyes, the nose is there, but once I tweak the hair a little bit, I think you'll see that maybe this comes in a little bit more closer to the character that Paul Rudd was playing in the Anchorman movies. Now, when we're talking about this Brian Fontana character, a couple of different memories from the movie come to mind, some of the big punchlines, the big jokes, and at least in my opinion, there was no bigger joke, no bigger laugh out of that movie than the joke about the clone named Sex Panther. So we're using this particular video to kind of highlight that moment of the movie, and that's what you see in his hand there is the jar that has the kind of the panther head that holds the rather toxic cologne that the movie pokes some fun at. Now, pose on here was relatively easy. Once I got an idea of what I wanted the head to be doing, the rest of the body kind of sketched in around it. With the rest of the characters, and again, you'll see some links scattered through the video here that you can go back and take a look at the other three. But for this character, I wanted to do a little bit different, and mostly just in the sense of how he was dressed. All the other characters were very formally dressed. Burgundy's wearing a formal suit and tie. The other two are wearing ties as well. In an attempt to try to do something just at least a little bit different, maybe mostly because I was just tired of drawing ties all the time, I decided to go with a slightly different costume here on Brian, and that was really kind of based off the beginning of the movie where they were at a pool party together. So he was wearing something of like a orange leather jacket and a striped shirt underneath of it. Big open collar, large butterfly kind of lapel look to it. A lot of fun to draw because, again, it was really kind of like an overdone fashion of the time, but it kind of speaks to the time period that they're sitting in. And again, this is a little bit different. Even though I was drawing a lot of large collars, the idea of having it open and letting all that chest hair hang out was a lot of fun to get into. And, you don't see it now, but trust me, that chest hair is coming. Now, again, we're making an allusion here to the Sex Panther cologne, so, stay tuned to the end. You'll see a little punchline kind of pop up there, just kind of relating to a quote from the movie, as I did with the rest of the videos in this series. But what I'm doing right now, if you notice here, is just kind of finalizing in some of my line work. Now, I'm not going with anything really tough on this one, just because I kind of have an idea in my head of what the joke is going to be, and the joke is really going to be tied to that punchline coming at the end, which is, again, just a quote from the movie, no big deal. But, now that we've got, the head laid in here the way we want, we've got the eyes looking, vaguely Paul Ruddish, if that's a word, then the rest of this kind of sketches in really easy. There were no really good pictures of the Sex Panther cologne, so I kind of made that up, and then just drew some basic hands and attached them to the arms through the arms of the jacket. So what I'm trying to do here, though, is keep very aware of how I want to kind of separate all this stuff into layers when I get into the color phase. So you may notice that the shoulder kind of cuts off weird on the jacket, and it's because in the foreground, on a separate layer, we'll have the hand holding the cologne bottle there to kind of hide that area that I kind of cut off in a very awkward fashion. Now, as these basic kind of mid-tone colors go in here, this is where you're going to see the separation of the layers. All right, so we have one arm on a layer, we have another arm holding the cologne with another layer, the main torso on its own layer, and then the head a layer in and of itself. What you can't see is that there's also the background. The background I've already got in, but I'm just hiding it right now so I can get this gray background just to use as something to kind of compare colors against. So the background that we're not seeing is the one that's present in all the videos in this series. It's that kind of blue Channel 4 logo background. I copied and pasted it out of the other previous works that I did. Put it in here, and again, I'm just hiding it with a layer of gray right now so I can use this gray to kind of compare tones together and make sure I'm getting the color values that I'm looking for as I kind of continue to paint this in. So what you'll see here is that I'm kind of starting off with some red. I went with a really, really pale kind of yellowish orange for my basic flesh tone, and in order to kind of breathe life into the character, I believe that the red is a really kind of essential element to this, especially in the areas of the face where the blood gets close to the surface of the skin. So in the, the cheek and in the nose and a little bit in the lips and the chin, even in the forehead, we're going to see some of that. Now, the blue that you're seeing coming in now is related to his 5 o'clock shadow. So yeah, it's heavy, it's really kind of overly saturated, but what I'm trying to do right now is just kind of get in where it's supposed to be, and you'll see me kind of smoothing out some of the rougher edges, kind of getting more of a graduated tone to some of the areas, and then immediately lower the opacity just to give it that bare 5 o'clock shadow look. Now that I've got in the reds and I've got in the blues for the shadow, they may look like they're still a little bit too heavy and they need to be kind of dialed back a little bit, but they're going to get covered up by the shadows and the light layers that I'm about to put in here. So I want to do this kind of separately through each layer, starting with the head and then moving on to the other layers that are separate body parts. But you can see how the shadow kind of goes in here. It's covering up elements of the redness in the cheeks and the redness in the forehead, and you'll see something similar happening with the shadow that's put in around that chin area, kind of covering up and kind of desaturating or maybe even graying out a little bit the blue that was present for that 5 o'clock shadow. So as the shadow goes in here, the rest of the stuff kind of blends in with it and creates this tone that gives it, something of a more realistic, maybe even slightly photorealistic look when it comes to the blends. You can see the light's going to complement that a little bit as well. I got something of a yellowish light and then a brighter white light I'm putting in over top of it, and all these kind of layers stacked on top of each other, all kind of feeding off on each other, really kind of give you this sense of the flesh tone, which in and of itself is difficult to achieve. There isn't really just one color that a face looks like unless you're wearing heavy makeup. So again, you're going to have red areas where blood reaches to the surface of the skin a little bit closer. You're going to have areas where light bounces off, like the tip of the nose, and all these are slightly different colors, but they kind of need all to blend together. And my method of doing it is really just to kind of stack layers on top of each other with blend modes. So if we do a little bit of a review here with the face, I'll kind of walk you through it, but just understand here that as I talk about the face, the same methodology is going to be applied to every other part of the body when I get to that individual layer. But on the face, I started with my basic mid-tone, that kind of light, palish flesh tone that I started with. Again, it's more kind of a yellowish orange, very, very on the kind of light, almost white side. Now, because that's so pale, the red comes in next, and it kind of gets smeared around the areas where we see a lot of red in the face: forehead, cheeks, chin. Slightly different color for the lip as well. It's going to look a little bit pink, but again, as shadow and light goes in, that'll kind of desaturate a little bit, help it blend in with the rest. Okay, so we also got the eyes that were painted in. Nothing really special to speak to in terms of the eyes. We just have kind of the whitish irises and then the blue kind of, maybe that's the iris. I don't know the parts of my eye all that well. But I will say this before we move on here. The white that you're seeing in the white of his eyes is not a pure white. Pure white is something I very, very rarely ever use. If anything, this has actually got a little bit of a blue, grayish tint to it. So it's not in a pure stark white. Again, that's used very rarely and only really for highlights. But if you notice, you really can't tell just by the way that it kind of compares and contrasts to the rest of the colors on the face. So it does make sense that it should have a little bit of a bluish tint to it. If you're talking about somebody that might be a little bit drunk or maybe they're on drugs or something like that, a little kind of red tint to their eyes would make sense, and giving it that pinkish tone, getting a little bit away from that bright white, actually makes it look a little bit more natural. Just a little piece of advice there. Now, moving on from the eyes here, again, we have a face that's in a couple different layers. So again, we have our midtones, which represents that lip color, the eye color, and everything like that. The red goes on top of it, and again, a lowered opacity. Same thing with the blue and the 5 o'clock shadow. Goes on top of the red, lowered opacity. So I'm taking those opacities down to maybe about 15-20%. Super light, super subtle, but it creates a good effect that kind of lingers once you get the shadows and the lights in. And those are the next layers. So I had the red, I had the blue for the 5 o'clock shadow, and then my shadow layer. My shadow layer is going to be a multiply layer. Basically, it's a layer set to a blend mode named multiply. I use this for all my shadows. And if you notice, I have a 4-color palette sitting over the left-hand side. So my lighter shadow color is the kind of upper right-hand color there. That's kind of the bluish gray. And because I'm painting this in a layer set to multiply, the multiply blend mode will pull up colors underneath of it from the layers below that shadow layer and kind of almost mix them all together, so that way that kind of bluish tone will change depending on what's being painted on top of it. So as I paint that shadow tone over top of the red in the forehead, or even that reddish yellowish color that's in the cheek, and then getting into that blue area in the chin there, it is that same shadow tone, but it's changing slightly depending on the color that's underneath of it, and gives it something of a more rich shadow texture. And it makes it look a little bit more naturalistic. Now, in certain areas, I'm going to go back with another shadow layer, and I'm going to put in a darker shadow for areas where it's almost kind of pure black, but we don't quite get there. So you'll see that in my little 4-color palette, lower right-hand corner, there's kind of a dark gray that has some tint of blue in it, and that's going to be my darker shadow, as I said before. Now, I'm using blues for shadows just because I'm considering light source here. My light source, if we're kind of imagining this to be a real-world scenario, would be studio lights. He's taking photographs for the news station he works for instance. So those studio lights are going to be very warm colors. They're going to be very bright whites, very bright yellows, maybe even bordering line on orange in a couple of different areas. And that means the shadows have to be the opposite. We're going to go with cool shadows, and that means something of a blue and a blue-gray type shadow. Now, if you were to take a look at these two colors on the color wheel, the blue and the kind of the weirdish yellow, they're not quite opposites on the color wheel, but they're darn close. And that's exactly what I'm using for, is that contrast between light and shadow to create that illusion of 3 dimensions on the surface of the canvas here. All right, so we're not really very far from the end here, so a couple little details I'll comment on. You'll notice that I'm also trying to hide my line work as I go along here. So hiding my line work is really just a matter of taking the line work that I use as the basis to kind of color everything in, and I'll duplicate that layer and then put it on alpha lock. Now, the reason I duplicate the layer is so that way I have a backup layer just in case I do something wrong when I'm trying to recolor the line work through a first pass. So all I do is make a duplicate, and I save the extra copy, kind of move it out of the way, and I turn it off so it's not visible. I just kind of hold it as a backup plan in case I ever need to go back to it. Then I take the duplicated layer, again I set it to an alpha lock, and that alpha lock means that I can change the color of the lines, but I won't actually change the lines themselves. I won't be able to erase them, I won't be able to make them thicker or anything like that. All I can do is just change the color of them. So once I have that setting in place, then it's easy to kind of color pick some of the darker shadow areas, or maybe even some of the some of the lighter highlight areas, and use that to help me hide some of my line work. Great example of this, take a look at that left arm there with that highlight that comes in really bright on the left hand side of that arm. The line is almost completely hidden there because all I do is color pick that bright yellowish white color and use it to paint in the line with that alpha lock setting on. Detail work is really all that's left here. Again, you'll notice the chest hair has gone in, and some of the detail in terms of highlights on the hair have gone in. So there's really not a lot left to this other than just kind of put in a couple little shadows, and in just a second we're also going to see me remove that palette and put in our big word balloon we've been waiting for. Again, this is just something of a quote from the movie. I'm paraphrasing just a little bit, but it's a funny one, and it's one that I'm absolutely fond of. It's called Sex Panther. 60% of the time, it works every time. I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, this is number 4 of a 4-part series, so go back and check out the rest. And if you haven't had a chance to subscribe, please make sure you do so. It helps out a lot, and it ensures that you're supporting some good artwork, or at least my artwork at the very least. Again, stop back. I got some more videos coming soon, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.